we need a little bit more feedback probably from the Galaxies collaboration to really be able to understand what this means for their science. But these are the major things. Our other questions were, what's the effect on PhotoZ? And Melissa Graham very kindly ran some simulations for me using the median co-added depths from the Wagfest Deep. And I think Melissa is here, and if you have anything to add to what I'm going to very, very briefly say here, that would be great. But mostly what we found here is that so the blue line is baseline V3.3, and there's a magenta line in here which is 3.2, and while the new throughputs actually make the photometric the PhotoZ measurements at low Z improve, so that improved depth in G band does better, overwhelms that loss of depth in U band. Although at Z of about 2, it's a little worse. However, the uncertainties are also very large at this point. So it's a good question. So here we have the robust standard deviation as a function of photometric redshift. And this one is the same thing, but zoomed in at low redshift. This plot on the right versus the left. And then here is the fraction of outliers, and it just behaves very similarly to the robust deviation. Melissa has 2 papers that detail this, what went into what's being calculated here a little bit in more detail. But basically this is, so there's not, again, not a super obvious like problem as a result of changing the throughputs and losing that depth in U-band in PhotoZs, but we would like to know more about whether this, the change in the photometric redshift accuracy and outliers at Z of 2 is going to be a significant thing that we should consider. And then the final thing is, when we're looking at the mapping of the Milky Way and stellar metallicities, this also depends on U-band, and we don't have a good metric on this right now. So this might be a place where we have a missing metric, and we've started talking to the Milky Way groups and the various task forces about this, but we don't have an answer for that yet. So for those who may be interested in writing metrics but need help putting it together, we do have a set of tutorials which are online, and we'll put together a video tutorial soon if that would be useful for people, and we are always able to help with email or on community.lssc.org. And we don't currently have office hours, but we're happy to put some up if that would be helpful for people. And I think, yeah, that's it.
Excellent. You did great timing. Thank you very much, then.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, the floor is open for question, and I see Jeff has raised his hand first, and then Simona.
Yeah, so I just want to comment. So Z of 2 is exactly where we expect problems because the Lyman break shows up in the U-band there. And so this is a big factor not for an LSST only case, but DESI2 really wants to target Lyman break galaxies at redshifts 2 to 3. And so for DESI2, this would be actually a very large impact. So on the DESI side, there is interest in seeing how well we can push the U depth to compensate for the throughput loss.
Thank you, Jeff.
So, yeah, how would we? I know some people are working on incorporating additional feedback and information from PhotoZ metrics, but this would be probably some helpful things to get more details about, I guess.
Yeah, I'll have a couple of slides about DESI2 on Friday, but only a couple.
Yeah, thank you.
But this might be good to have a discussion at the. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say this might be a good topic of discussion at one of the DESI desk coordination group telecons. Might be good to follow up there, perhaps.
Excellent. Yes. Indeed, there's a couple of things that we should talk about survey strategy in those calls, and this is one of them. And for anybody else that has input on this, like, we do need scientific input as of how to weight the gains at low and medium redshift against the losses at high redshift for the optimization. So input on this specifically is extremely welcome. Thank you. Simona, I see your hand, and then Meg.
Yeah, so I will speak more about this on Friday. It's interesting that you spoke about the input by the Galaxies collaboration, because several members asked about this, and they were wondering where they can find more information on the exact loss in U-band exposure. They heard that the U-band exposure would be increased by 50% in length to compensate for the loss in the efficiency, but they couldn't find any numbers. So it will be extremely useful to have a better quantification of how the depth of the U-band will be impacted. And for the science, they mentioned active sources, metallicity determination, and reddening measurements in the Milky Way. And they were especially thinking to the fact that without the U-band will be, without a good depth in the U-band, it would be difficult to do science on the plane and bulge of the galaxy. So I'm wondering if we could have more quantification where we can find it. So if you have any advice, will be very useful.
So I'm not entirely certain what you're looking for. I think there was a couple of things that may have gotten mixed together there. The change in the depth is reflected in the new simulation. So if you have metrics which would run on optim output, they will include that change in the depth that is included in part of the V3.3 baseline. If you're just looking for like what would the overall change in depth for a co-edited image be, you can take that out of the, we do put up the metric results for each simulation. So we do have a list of like, here's what the co-edited depths are. Mostly it's for the Whitefest deep is where you'll get just a number that you could read off. But if you have a particular part of the sky where you're saying, well, I actually want the depth in this part of the sky, and maybe including, you know, reddening, then we can calculate that. But again, this would be the kind of thing that we would really like to have in mathematics. If you're asking though about like the variation of simulations, like what might we do to compensate for the change, that is a set of simulations that we're looking at and doing for the SCOC to sort of consider like what are the options, like what are the impacts if we do change it. And Fed can give you more information about like the plan for how to evaluate those simulations. It was not really the idea to make the full set available to everybody, just because some of them are not really very realistic. We're not going to go to that particular kind of option. So
yeah, let me add a couple of things here. So the information about like what is the magnitude loss in the throughput is on this slide. This slide actually, a version of this slide that was actually shared by the liaisons. They have it available and they can share it, and I think they share it with most science collaborations. So the numbers of how the throughput changed, if that's what you want to base your analysis on, are these. I think it's more consistent with the work of the SCOC, with the general work that as it has been planned and organized for the Rubin, for the optimization of the survey strategy, to work based on metrics. So the simulations that include the new throughput, but do not change the survey strategy from the phase 2 recommendation, are available to the community. So you can see the impact of primarily the change of throughput, although as we pointed out, there's a couple of other differences, including some differences that have some bug fixes that have put more images in U-band. So the impact of the throughput loss is already slightly compensated because we already have more images in U-band. And the analysis of those science metrics is what Lynn has just presented. So specifically for a couple of science collaborations, for a couple of science cases really, where we have metrics that respond to these changes, but we have a set of metric, one for each filter. including the one that you showed, Lynn, for the number of galaxies. If that's the metric that comes to the SCOC, it's hard for us to understand what the scientific impact is. And of course, the liaisons are very helpful with this. And we did have conversations with Luis, who is the liaison on the Galaxy Science Collaboration, which I know brought this issue to the Galaxy Science Collaboration, that we need more scientific input on how to read this plot. Like, does the increase in all the other bands in number of galaxies, how does that compare with the loss in the number of galaxies in U-band, for us to be able to include that in the optimization? So that is what we meant when Lynn said we need a little bit more input. And then, yes, as Lynn said, if there's other things that are not coded in math, but that help you understand the impact, such as, I don't know, the co-added depth in different bands at year 3.8, I don't know. Those are not hard for us to produce. Those just like quantitative assessments of depths over time. It's something that if you don't have it available, we can make it happen.
Yeah, I think I will solicit members of the Galaxies to be more active in, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Simona, for that. And another thing that you mentioned bulge and Milky Way. We will hear tomorrow from the task force on Milky Way and Galaxy. Actually, I did have one more comment. Sorry, Meg, for making you wait just 1 second. So the SCOC has asked and is reviewing like a grid of simulations where the exposure time in U-band and the number of images in U-band are varied, just to like get our footing and understand what is the range of reasonable options that we should consider to tweak the survey strategy to even maximize even more the scientific throughput. Because it's a grid of simulations, we have an internal review of them at the moment to see which ones are really at the boundary, which one really define the boundary conditions. We do expect to make simulations available with different compensations for the U-band to the community as well, when we have a slightly clearer idea of what subset of those are useful.
Thank you, that will be really useful.
Sure. Lynn, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's good. We go to Meg's question.
Yeah.
So I'm asking a question about strategy at this point. Is that, to me, this seems like a really minor tweak in the cadence. And that this tweak is starting to get into possibly the bits of time that you could get back with snaps, going from 2 to 1, for example. And so guess the question I have is, if the amount of time to tweak to, that you'd want to add to U-band is really on that level of a small percentage, right, which is very hard to pull out within the survey, is it at the time that really the simulations need to branch into 2 strategies, one with 2 snaps, one with 1 snap, so that the SCOC can make this decision, the community can understand what happens in both scenarios? Because originally the thought was, there's so many possibilities, running these 2 scenarios is too difficult. But I would imagine at this point, there's a lot of evidence pushing, unless the camera really has an issue, in terms of being able to, in the images and then the processing of it to identify cosmic rays, is probably heading towards 1 snap. And so is this at the level, because I don't quite understand how much number of visits would need to be added to boost it, at that level of a small percentage of the time back you get from going to 1 snap could easily solve this problem? And so I'm just wondering if you can give some scale on that, of like how many U-band observations we're thinking about. Because if it's at that level, then maybe that's something that gets thrown into that bit before you go through and change all the distributions and the other filters to end up making the decision to go to 1 snap. Especially if that 1 snap decision is going to come the minute, there's decent enough ComCam images to assess. So just wondering if you had some thoughts on that or could clarify.
Sure. Yeah, so changing the mirror coatings to triple silver is something that, like I said, it increases the overall survey efficiency by 20%. However, if there was a showstopper, like, oh, actually with this distribution of depths between the different filters, then we actually we wouldn't do that. So this question of like what to do about is the U-band depth changing by this much? Because it's significant, like it is a difference in depth from previous simulations in individual images of about 0.4 magnitudes. And so if that was a complete showstopper, we would have to decide that first because the coatings go on the mirror early. So I get what you're saying, like, is it time to branch into two snaps or not? That is I actually think that's a separate kind of question. Like, so first of all, this is a 20% increase when we go to the different coatings. We may, if we had to not do that, then we would need to know immediately. If we decide, yes, triple silver looks great. I mean, from all I've seen, it looks great. And then changing the distribution of like exposure time in U-band or number of visits in U-band, yes, it is less than 10%. However, and on the order of 10% is about what we gain with the snaps. It's actually like somewhere between 7 and 9%. However, the question of whether we go, once we go to the question of whether we go to one snap or not, I would actually kind of like to leave that a little bit separate for the reason that I think it's most likely we'll go to one by 30-second visits. That is a SCOC decision, so you know I don't know the answer for sure, but I think that seems, and it also depends on the capability to do that. But there are enough other uncertainties in the first year that even if we did change that, I actually would like that not to necessarily change our underlying strategy. And I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is it's like, it's a little complicated. This one seems like a question we can go ahead and answer, like no matter whether or not we do 2 snaps or 1 snap, like it doesn't matter, we'll just do different lengths of time in U-band. A lot of questions can be revisited after year 1, right? So presumably if we find, oh, we're really not meeting depth, but we could make it up by just having more U-band visits, then it would be okay. But I kind of think of them as 2 separate problems. Like deciding what our U-band exposure time, we can decide that and then we can be ready for it. And having that be stable over the survey, especially the first year, is probably a lot easier.
Yeah, and let me add that particularly because this is a scientific question of which science cases have suffered and how much and how they compare with the other science cases based on changes in throughput, we still want to optimize over that axis, regardless of the fact that if we do go to SNAP, we could use those SNAP to compensate for this. For one thing, because we don't know if we're going to SNAP and we won't know that until into commissioning, and we want to make as much of this analysis and this optimization as early as we can, and be ready for a survey that is optimized to the best of our ability and balanced to the best of our ability by the time we make that decision on the snaps. And I agree, Lynn, I agree with Lynn's thought about sort of keeping the increase in efficiency in snaps as contingency in year 1 is a good idea, because year 1 may, you know, there's a lot of risks that carry on with the beginning of the survey. Mike.
So I hear what you're saying, but then the SCOC needs to recommend that, and I would recommend making that decision sooner than later. Right. If all of the snaps contingency will go to contingency and operations, it would be helpful, I think, for the rest of us to know that. I think particularly if that's going to be all reserved for that. And that might be a reasonable assumption to make, but I think it's worth stating that sooner rather than later. And I guess my question is, there's a difference between if you were going to say that. Yeah,
that's not what I said. That's not what I meant to say. I meant to say in year 1.
Yeah, I'm talking about year 1. Yeah, I'm talking about year 1, that if any increase in snaps, there will be no change to the survey based on that. strategy. The scheduler will do whatever with the extra time if it's there. I think it's worth knowing that sooner rather than later, especially I think is because people have, I know I've already talked to people's thoughts about what to do with extra time. So I think if the SCOC is going in that direction and there's clear reasons to, then I think explaining them to that sooner rather than later, because I think there's things that may, right, you think on percent level may be taken care of that you wouldn't be, you know, that could go away, right, with these kind of small tweaks. The other question I have is, there seems to be a difference between U-band visits, length of visits, the number of U-band exposures. And so will there be is there going to be a decision about the separation between those two? Right, so is this mainly focused on increasing U-band exposures, right, to get the depth, or is it co-added depth? And is there a timeline for when this decision will be made? Or is this something that will go all the way till July of 2024? Because it seems like there's a very solid set of metrics. There's a very clear science collaboration that can answer a question. So is this something that do you I haven't heard a timeline on this one, where some of the other task force have like May deadlines. Is this one that can be answered sooner than that? Because I think this has more ripple effects to some of the other science collaborations than some of the other things that were presented in these task forces. And is there a task force for this specific issue? And
So
who, you know, if you could explain some of that, that would be helpful.
I can take at least part of this answer. So the SCOC is treating this not with the task force, but as an SCOC-wide discussion at the moment. If there are some more specific and narrow topics within this discussion, a task force may be instantiated. But also at the moment, we have 3 ongoing task forces. And I think at some point you saturate the number of task forces that you can handle and you know, monitor and support at once. The SCOC is evaluating whether increasing the exposure in U-band or increasing the number of exposures in U-band or a combination of those is the most beneficial route. To be honest, all the science metrics that we have available at the moment point to increasing number of exposures generally being more beneficial than compensating by increasing the number of exposure, generally being more beneficial than compensating by increasing the depth. And that's part of the reason why some of the metrics that we thought might be sensitive to this change of throughput ended up looking good in this version 3.3 simulations, because we already have a few more images in U-band due to the changes in the scheduler code. And then the other point, the other question that the other piece of question, sorry, there was one other thing. At the moment, I don't.
Timeline.
Yeah, so we just received, we are just making the simulations now, and so we haven't started evaluating them. Yes, and I do remember my other point. So we do have a straw person timeline, but it's quite fragile at the moment because we need to wrap our head around the problem a little bit better. And one thing that you said that I don't think is actually consistent with my impression is that we have a well-established and clear set of metrics for this. We have seen that particularly for this issue, we might be missing metric. We might be missing metric in the sense that some metric that exist by filter are not helping us to make this decision. We know that the particular science case of Milky Way halo with the study of through the study of dwarfs may be suffering from this, but we don't have a way to quantify that yet. We need to build a metric for that. We have a metric that measures photo Z, but we see gains in some regime, losses in some other regimes, and we need a little bit more scientific guidance to understand what that really means. So in fact, of all the topics that we're addressing, I think here we might not have all the metrics that we need, and so that's part of the reason why building a timeline on this is it's not trivial. Lynn, did you want to add anything? I see something in the chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the point, like any previous version of the like recommendations and questions for the community, we did have a much broader, like, what should the filter balance be, and should we have more visits in U-band? And we're not talking about as an extensive a change as that.
Oh,
So
yes.
just to be clear, what we're really talking about is, should we just roll with this, reduced U-band throughput and higher GRIZY throughput and leave it as that? Or should we try and compensate so we get back a little bit more towards V3.2 level co-edit depths? And it's not intended to take away the timer metrics from the other, things that are independent on those redder bands. Oops, sorry. I should stop sharing.
Mike.
So I guess my question is in past, when there have been decisions like this, these simulations that varied this were released to the community. So I was wondering, is it possible that the same simulations that the SCOC is looking at, we as a community can also get access to? So we can do that sanity check for ourselves, right? In the sense of that we can see that it doesn't change. Because if you're asking for input or possibly new metrics, having those simulations or an example of an extreme one or what is recommended as a possible change may be helpful, that we would be able to look at. I know often right now the SCOC seems to give us one simulation every once in a while. It tries to be the final one, but I'm wondering, given this is, fairly sensitive one, that has, ripple effects to possibly other science areas, where some of the other things are very sort of segmented to very, one science collaboration or two. I was just wondering, is that possible that if the simulations are made, that could be shared with the community, that we could, for those that are interested?
We absolutely plan on releasing simulations to the community. Some simulations in this that have been made were deliberately made to stretch the limit of what's useful, and we don't plan to release those. So we just plan to understand what is the subset of simulations that could conceivably be adopted and release that to the community without releasing simulations that are just not under consideration at all, because that just increases the noise and the workload on people, and then it makes it harder to communicate what should be considered and what shouldn't. Any other questions? We are almost at the top of the hour. We have 6 minutes left. Any comments? Any questions about the format of the workshop or anything else? Since I hear Meg.
It was just a question about, I think I think I might have the answer, is in past, there was usually this workshop, there was usually a simulation released. I'm assuming it sounds like there is not going to be there's not going to be, version 3.4 is not dropping in the next week. That the 3.3 is effectively this workshop's baseline. I just wanted to clarify that.
Version 3.3, the baseline. So this workshop is a little bit different from the other ones, because the other ones were designed around the specific survey strategy recommendation, so a phase 1 and the phase 2 survey strategy recommendation, and the simulations that were accompanying the workshop were those. But yes, you're absolutely right. The simulation that we are primarily discussing in this workshop, the updates to the simulation, is version 3.3 that includes the new throughput, which was just released in November. All right. If I see no other hands, I'm going to release everybody and see you all the day after tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific. On that day, we are going to hear from the Milky Way and Galactic Plane Task Force. We are going to hear work that Eric Belm is doing on understanding how the templates will be constructed in year 1. And we'll have a community-focused discussion. Please, if you are one of the representatives from the science collaboration, Make sure you look at the straw person schedule for the short presentations by the science collaboration and let me know if that conflicts with your schedule. That still can be rearranged and moved. And if there is anything else, please communicate ideally on the Slack channel, or feel free to reach me in person on Slack or by email. And yeah. Oh, and the science collaborations and community members that wish to present, if you have slides and you want to share them with us, it would be great, and we can post them on publicly on the Slack channel. You can put the link there, or you can send it to me. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you on Friday.
Thank you. Bye-bye.